What's up, losers? Can you hear me? I'm outside. It's another OGGM walking adventure. Well, I've got something on my mind and I'm waiting for something. So you may notice that in my last several posts, I refer to 5th edition as it is today not being Dungeons & Dragons. And of course it's Dungeons & Dragons. Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro can call whatever the fuck they want Dungeons & Dragons. They could call my hat Dungeons & Dragons, and it's Dungeons & Dragons. It's Dungeons & Dragons because it uses the same 6 stats. It's Dungeons & Dragons because it still uses the same basic mechanics it's always used. So yes, post Tasha's, post Critical Role 5th edition is still technically Dungeons & Dragons. Now, what do I mean by it's not Dungeons & Dragons anymore? I think what I mean is Critical Role and Tasha's has changed the paradigm of the hobby so drastically, and it's continuing to change so drastically that by the initial definition example of what the game was, it has become so overly complicated and such a mishmash peanut butter and jelly sandwich of just I don't even know what the hell anymore, that you cannot really call it Dungeons & Dragons. You kind of have to call it pick and choose. It really has become the D20 Wizards of the Coast fantasy game, which is fine. I mean, but, you know, if somebody approached you today and said, can you run D&D, what would you run? What is 5th edition now, today, post Tasha's, post Candlekeep, post Ravenloft? I mean, how do you deal with the things like if somebody says to you, oh, you can't hold my character with your magic gobbledygook because you're affecting my ableism and I have claustrophobia, so I can't go in a dungeon because I'm afraid of small places. How do you, as a 5th edition dungeon master, trying to remain true to whatever the current paradigm of 5th edition is, run 5th edition? I don't know what I would run if somebody came up to me and said, I want to play D&D. I would say, all right, we can play a role-playing game, we can play Dungeons & Dragons, or we can play 5th edition. And if we play 5th edition, we have to all agree on what is and is not going to be allowed because there's just so much. And from my personal experience, I don't know if I've actually played 5th edition as written. And this is part of the problem, is that every 5th edition game I've played has been so tweaked, so house ruled, so many no you can't, that it isn't 5th edition in anything other than how it's written. The last 5th edition game I played definitely was not 5th edition. The previous 5th edition game I played was definitely not 5th edition. And pretty much every 5th edition game I played was not 5th edition. It was somebody trying to use 5th edition to run a completely different game. At which point you're just like, well, then why don't you just find a game that'll do what you want to do instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole and make D&D into something that's not. 5th edition is 5th edition. And now post Tasha's, it's 5th edition is 5th edition plus tons of stuff where you all have to agree yes or no. I mean, that's why, again, Session Zero is so important. So what is 5th edition? I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it is. I don't know what Dungeons & Dragons means to you, to that guy, to that person anymore. It definitely doesn't mean to me what it means to that person. I mean, to me, Dungeons & Dragons is Player's Handbook plus maybe one other source book, and DM is always correct. Maybe not always right, but the DM is always correct. And if, we all agree what's going to be allowed, what's not going to be allowed, and that's it, And if you have issues with eyeballs or being underground or your character being placed in a hold person, you probably shouldn't be playing Dungeons & Dragons. But if we say, oh, I'm not going to have that, I'm not going to let you hold my character, you have to have my permission before you kill me, that's not D&D, that's a completely different game. So that's why I say post Tasha's 5th edition D&D is not Dungeons & Dragons. It's Wizards of the Coast fantasy role-playing game, D20. And 6th edition will probably be Wizards of the Coast Magic the Gathering D20 role-playing game, which is fine. I have no trouble running D&D, but there are certain caveats. And if it's not going to be allow those caveats, if you're going to try and turn Dungeons and Dragons into a King Arthur human-only role-playing game, which one of the 5th edition games I was in was, it's not 5th edition. It's a different game. Find the King Arthur human-only role-playing game that's already been written. Don't try and make 5th edition into a King Arthur human-only role-playing game and still call it 5th edition. Because if you say 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, people have certain expectations. And if you then try and create something else, it's not 5th edition. I don't know what 5th edition is. So that's why I say. Anyways, I'm your grumpy guide to all things gaming. If you appreciate this content, you know what to do. Hit that like, hit that subscribe, support me via DM's Guild, and above all, get off my lawn.